Welcome to the Be Vulnerable session of the Be Like Jesus, Live Like Jesus series. We're so glad you're a part of this conversation. I'm Louisa. What do you think about or feel when you consider the word vulnerable? Does it bring back memories when you have allowed yourself to be vulnerable with others? Was that a good or difficult situation? The Oxford Dictionary defines vulnerable as being susceptible to physical or emotional attack. Some other adjectives used are unguarded, exposed, wide open, and defenseless. Wow. How many of us truly consider being vulnerable as an important characteristic in building a more loving, peace-filled world? For most of us, there is a great anxiety of feeling alone and being rejected when we expose the truth of our fears, failings, or frailties. Consider Scripture in the book of Genesis, where we find Adam and Eve hiding from God in the garden when they realized they were naked. As human beings, we often want to reveal only our strength and tend to stand in the shadows when it comes to our fears and weaknesses. So what does vulnerability have to do with love and peace? American researcher, lecturer, and professor Brené Brown states that vulnerability is the core, the heart, and the center of meaningful human experiences. She suggests that in being more open and unguarded, we allow ourselves to become more honest, more empathetic, and more authentic. We're able to build stronger relationships. In this session, we will be exploring vulnerability in the person of Jesus. What do his words and actions tell us? What was he trying to show his first disciples? What is he asking of us? From the moment Jesus entered humanity, his life embodied the spirit of vulnerability. The previous adjectives of unguarded, exposed, wide open, and defenseless all apply to Jesus at some point in his 33 years on earth. He was a risk taker for the love of us. We hope you will take time in your small group to share your reaction to the scripture passages provided, placing yourself into the scene. Here, you will be witnesses as Jesus models incredible vulnerability and urges his disciples to do the same. In following Jesus' example, they were able to spread his message of the kingdom of truth, love, and peace. We would like to thank longtime friends Tony and Steve for sharing their story in this session's witness video. You were truly an inspiration. Enjoy your discussion time, remembering that God already knows our fears and our failings and still loves us beyond all measure. Press pause now and refer to your small group guide. When it refers to the witness talk, press play again.
In 2003, I was in a position where I was leading people in a leadership program. And it just so happened that Steve was in the program. And so we started to have lunch. There was a gap, obviously, then in time. So after we graduated from Marshfield Columbus, Steve went on to college at Marquette in Eau Claire. I went over to St. John's in Minnesota. And so there was a gap of probably a good 12 to 15 years or more. And so anyway, we reconnected when Steve was in the program. I was directing this program, and we started to have lunch about once a month, I think, as I recall, and just started to share life and family and jobs and struggles and joys, all of it, just over lunch. So that was kind of our reconnection after all those years.
So I was at a place where I needed to find a way to incorporate some social outreach in my life. It had always been a big part of who I was, high school and college, and even when Michelle and I were first married, but we had children and life got busy, and pretty soon you're sort of consumed in your own little world, and I felt a need, a real direction to find something, some way. And I was having lunch with Tony and mentioning this, and he asked me how in the world I was going to do this, right? Because I was raising 3 kids and involved in 100 different things in my parish and working, 50 hours a week and all the stuff that you do when you're a young dad in his late 30s. And Tony asked me what I was going to do, and I realized that whatever I needed to do, whatever I wanted to do, I was going to have to do it after 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, because everything else I was doing was already such a burden on my family, right? I didn't want to take any more time away from Michelle and from the boys. So I said to Tony, it's got to be at night, it has to be late at night, but everything's closed, right? All of the outreach programs, all the social services, everything you normally volunteer at would be closed, but I mentioned that there are still people at 10 o'clock at night out in the world that need somebody and need help. I felt compelled to just go out where they were. Tony, being Tony, was like, I'm in on that. That sounds organic, and let me know. So that was on a Wednesday, and before he could change his mind, I said, we're doing Friday night. So Friday night, we went downtown and sat on a street corner in an at-risk neighborhood to sort of let the Spirit bring whatever the world needed to us, I guess. I don't know if we knew what we were doing. We did not know what we were doing. But we went out, and that was the birth of Streetlights Outreach.
It was interesting because it was a really vulnerable feeling going down that first night, going down to an at-risk neighborhood, downtown Green Bay, not knowing who we would encounter, not knowing how to engage people on the streets. Neither one of us had a tremendous amount of experience with at-risk populations or people on the margins at that point. My first service experiences would have been about 10 years before that, but still a very limited experience. So going that first night was this feeling of just putting yourself out there and not knowing exactly what we were walking into. And to me, that was a pretty vulnerable feeling. And as I mentioned before, I mean, I'm a fairly strong introvert, so that engagement of people doesn't necessarily come naturally. And so that was, if you want to say this is your comfort zone, that experience was definitely outside of that comfort zone for me.
There's so much safety, there's so much security and comfort in structure, right? In go here at this time and be this and do this task, and you're gonna, and you end up processing people or whatever the case might be, but there's just comfort and security in joining a structure. So for Tony and me to just go out at 10 o'clock at night in an at-risk neighborhood with no structure at all, and to just be present there, that was a weird feeling. That was very vulnerable, yeah. There was a bank that had a parking lot with a little bit of hedge on the corner, and there was a certain security about being in that parking lot. So I called the bank and asked for permission to sort of set up in their parking lot. And I mean, that was a hard no. I mean, they were just flat out, no, we're not having that in our parking lot. And it was a little disheartening. And so there's a part of me that said, let that voice discourage you, right? Well, there's our answer. No, we're not allowed. We can't go do it. But of course, the sidewalk right out on the street is public, and we could go there. In fact, it was the only place we could go. So that vulnerability was to actually be right there on the sidewalk, on the corner. Cars are driving by, people are walking by. We were a couple of yahoos in lawn chairs, and
who we jokingly said looked like a couple guys waiting for either a parade to start or we missed the boat in terms of how to tailgate at Lambeau Field, because that's kind of what it looked like. We're out there on the street corner with a couple lawn chairs, a sign behind us that said Streetlights Outreach, and that's all we were. That's all we had, and just us, two people, two guys.
Yeah, so think about that, a couple of 39-year-old guys in lawn chairs sitting in a neighborhood like this that 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. We did not feel like we belonged there.
I would also say too, I mean, there's something about dark, right? There's a vulnerability about being in the dark. And I would say that you could go down to that same street corner during the daylight, noon, 1 o'clock. That street corner looks different. But you can now turn the lights off. Now the darkness comes. And there's just a different feel, a different character, and different characters.
Different population.
Who come out at that time of the night. And so that, I think, kind of wove into the vulnerability of the situation as well.
And that's true literally and metaphorically, right? I mean, we were literally in the dark, but metaphorically, we were in the dark. To vulnerable, we were in a place we weren't familiar with, doing something we didn't understand.
So I don't remember if it's the first night. So I'll just say the first person in my memory of real significance was a man by the name of Rooster. And so I don't remember how deep into the experience Rooster came, but he would have been the first person that really caught our attention, I think, in terms of this is the type of person who's on the street at that time of night, 10 o'clock till midnight, who is dealing with some deep, deep wounds. This guy in particular, from being a veteran, and had experienced a whole bunch of terrible things, and had basically tried to drink away those memories. And he poured himself out to us one night.
It was really interesting. I mean, Rooster was homeless in a very chronic and stereotypical way. He's what you think of when you think of Skid Row level homeless. And we encountered him. He was passed out in an entryway on a storefront. And when we started to build a rapport, of course, he didn't trust us, right? Because when you're homeless, you don't trust people. But once he realized that we were not there to relocate him or process him or change him, but we were there just to love him and listen to him, he really opened up and he shared his story, and it was moving. It was powerful. It was very powerful. One of the things that he really taught me, right, the last time we saw him, it was the end of the night, we embraced, and of course Rooster represented everything that you expect of the street. I mean, you could smell the stale whiskey and the diesel exhaust from the buses and the pungency of not having showered and dirty clothes, and he pulls us in really close, right? And he pulled really close, and I remember him saying, "Thank you for giving me someone to love." And I had never thought about that, right? Because we went down there thinking that we were going down there to maybe help people. We didn't realize that he needed someone to care about too. And we weren't just there caring about him. What he really needed was someone that he could love back.
Rooster had I still get a little choked up when I think about him, because he had a great effect on where Streetlights Outreach and where homeless ministry went in the city of Green Bay. And the reason why I say that is, it was several months after we first met Rooster. We saw him a couple times, and then we didn't see him anymore. So I asked somebody in the context of a meeting about homelessness from Salvation Army, if I remember right, if they had seen Rooster, if he had come in. And they said, no, he had died. And I said, but do you know how? What were the circumstances? And they said he died under a bridge in Green Bay, the classic, what you don't ever want to see happen to somebody. And I said to the person, I never heard about it. I didn't see no bit in the paper. I didn't, which was a real awakening to me, because she said, you're not going to see somebody like Rooster in the paper. You're not going to see somebody like Rooster have a funeral. He's going to have a pauper's something, maybe at Salvation Army. Nobody's going to know about it. He probably doesn't have a grave. It's a completely different situation from what you're probably used to. And it was in that context of Rooster dying and us finding out about it that we had begun to have some conversations about the need for more emergency shelters in Green Bay and a place where a rooster could go, having, drank, and there just wasn't a place at that time for a person like that. So that led us to have some conversations with some people, which led to the formation of St. John's Homeless Shelter. In a kind of a straight line way, you can go from that story of meeting Rooster on the threshold of that storefront, to the formation of St. John's Homeless Shelter, and follow it right through the person of Rooster.
It was interesting, you had asked the first person that we met, and we were probably it was probably our second or third time out on the street, and someone had come by and asked us what we were doing, and we were told that I remember it was a young woman and a guy she was with, and they said, well, if you really want to help someone who's homeless, there's a guy sleeping right down the block here in a doorway, right? So we walked down there and they followed us, and there was that moment of the proof's in the pudding, right? What are you gonna do, right? Because I think we had been hoping that even though we were out there in our lawn chairs, that people would come to us and would meet us where we were at. But that vulnerability of going and meeting them where they're at, meeting Rooster exactly where he was at, on his turf, and making sure he was okay, and then building a relationship with him from the place he existed, not from the place we existed, and leaving that comfort. That was new. That was real new. It's a real awakening.
Well, and we didn't even know if the guy was living in that stairwell or the doorway. He didn't seem to have any life to him, and so, coming up and encountering a guy who you don't know if he's living or dead, that's a new experience, and that's like the ultimate vulnerability. So the reason why we went to Whitney Park, made this move from the near west side of Green Bay over to the east side, near east side, was Carina O'Malley was a sociology professor at St. Norbert College, but she's also considered kind of like the grandmother of homeless ministry in Green Bay. And she said to me one day, look, if you're gonna do what you're doing out on the streets, you got to get over to Whitney Park. And I said, what's up with Whitney Park? And she said, Whitney Park is like homelessness ground zero in Green Bay. That's where people gather. That's where people have lived. That's where people have formed community as a homeless community. So if you want to do homelessness ministry of some sort, if you want to be present to people out on the streets, that's where you got to be. So that was kind of an influence for us to check out Whitney Park and see what it looked like.
Where we were on the west side, it was an at-risk neighborhood. There had been a lot of issues there, but we were under a bright street light on busy roads right at an intersection, and suddenly we moved over to Whitney Park, which is off of any main streets, a lot of trees, some rather shady bars nearby, a lot of different types of characters moving in and out, and that's where we set up shop. So it was a different level of vulnerability, certainly.
I remember going down to the park one night, and we were there from 10 to midnight, which is usually our time frame. And the next day, they reported that somebody had been shot right on the street a half a block away from the park at about 12:30. And I started putting that time frame together. Being at Whitney Park, being in that neighborhood was going to ramp up the vulnerability just a bit, and it certainly did. One of my favorite Whitney Park stories of all time involved, and it was probably about a few years, I think, if I remember right, indoor experience at Whitney Park. There was this guy, his name was Jerry, and Jerry would come down the street. He lived about 2 blocks from Whitney, and he would come down the street, and we would usually be standing on a street corner or sitting on a picnic table, many times pull over a picnic table from the park. And Jerry would walk past us like grumbling, swearing under his breath. Just
under his breath.
Okay, verbally swearing at us. Right, as he was making his way probably down to the nearest tavern, and then he would walk back and he would swear some more at us, and this went on for like 3 or 4 weeks. You know, he would come by, usually about the same time, swearing at us, not real pleasant. And every time we would say, "Hey, how you doing?" and the swearing would start. And then usually we would end by saying, "Have a great night." Right? Well, like I said, this went on about 3 or 4 times. And on, I think the 4th week, Jerry is coming and we're bracing for the usual. And on that particular night, it was almost like a miracle happened. He said, "Move over, sailor, I'm sitting down tonight." And he sat on the picnic table and started telling a story. And I think our eyes were like bugging out, because here was this man who was hardened and had, a tough life. And he didn't want anything to do with some guy sitting in a park on a picnic table. But on that particular night, he opened himself up. He became vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, in our vulnerability, a relationship developed in which we became pretty darn good friends, and so much so that he invited us to his, I think it was his 70th birthday party. He was a regular at our Streetlights Outreach block parties. If he missed one, he'd be disappointed. He became like our biggest cheerleader, really, for Streetlights.
He was there every week, and once you listen to his story, once you listen to anyone's story, right? I think that's true of anyone. But with Jerry, once you listen to his story, you got the background and what had happened to him in his life and where he had been. You began to realize that we would all be exactly where Jerry is if we had traveled his journey, right? That he was really just trying to find ways to cope with what had been a very difficult life. But he would show up every Friday or Saturday night after that and spend time with us. He would park it and spend the evening with us. And one weekend, we both had different family things out of town, so we weren't down there that weekend. A week later, we got downtown at 10 o'clock, and Jerry's already has a picnic table pulled over to the corner. He's sitting there, and the first thing he says is, "Where were you guys last week?" And he was upset. We became family.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One other thing, sometimes when it was cold, think about 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night in January and February. It was nice out there in July and August, but in January, February, we had some rough nights. When it would get particularly cold and we didn't feel like there were going to be people out on the streets, we decided to, instead of what we would call outreach, we would do what we called inreach. So we would pick a little dive bar, a tavern, and go in and see if there's anybody who we could encounter and have some conversation with. And I remember one particular night when we encountered a man who had served in the Coast Guard. His name was Kurt. And Kurt had probably more pain within him than any person I've ever met in my entire life. And he shared stories of, I always pictured Coast Guard as these guys out on the Great Lakes, saving people who, floated away on a piece of ice or something, or their boat, capsized, or, they couldn't get their motor started or something. That, to me, that was Coast Guard. Kurt gave us this picture of Coast Guard that I had never heard about. dealing with pirates, dealing with drug smugglers, dealing with utter violence out on the seas. And with all of that, he was filled with so much pain. We spent a good amount of time with Kurt, just listening and helping him process through some of that pain. So InReach sometimes had a little bit more vulnerability because we're dealing with some bars that we normally wouldn't go into, and encountering some people that we normally wouldn't encounter.
Yeah, Kurt intercepted opium boats in the Bering Sea, where there's no law. I mean, it was, he had a horrific story, and he carried a lot of pain inside of him that he never felt safe sharing with anyone. But there's so much, right? If you're going to be vulnerable with someone and you're going to let them be vulnerable with you, you have to open yourself up to them so they feel safe opening themselves up to you. Early on, we asked ourselves the question, how did Jesus do church? And when you process that, you begin to realize he did it without brick walls and stained glass. He did it without denominations. He did it without structure. He just did it out on the streets and the riverbanks where people are. And that became our model. I mean, that was what Streetlights Outreach was all about. As raw and organic, as interpersonal, as immediately present as Jesus was, without any structure. And there's so much safety in structure. There's so much security there, and there's so much vulnerability. And there's no one more vulnerable than Jesus was, right? I mean, the image of a cross is a pretty vulnerable image, but that's what we did. That's what we saw Streetlights Outreach was. It's just like the story of Rooster. I mean, you gotta go where the people are. You have to go meet them as they are, where they are, which is what Jesus did. It's like whether you're a Samaritan woman at a well, or you're, Peter and Andrew coming in off of their fishing boat. It doesn't matter, right? You just go, the leper in the street, and you just go meet people where they are, as they are. And that's it, right? That's it.
And I remember a night fairly early on. I mean, we'd been doing this for, I think, some time. And you were asking the question about, what are we out here for? I mean, what difference are we making by being present out here on the streets with Streetlights Outreach? And I love that story.
Yeah, that was in the autumn. We started this like in May, and we did all summer, every weekend, late at night. We'd go out on the street corner, and the weather was getting cold. The nights were getting cold, and and I asked Tony, how do we evaluate the value of this effort? And he asked what I meant by that. And I said, well, we've been coming out here and doing this, and we've talked to a lot of people. We've met a lot of people, but the number of people that we actually helped, right, that we got them a meal because they were hungry or some such thing, we could count on our fingers. But before he could respond, this guy walks around the corner. He's wearing this hooded sweatshirt with his hands shoved in the pockets, and he asked us what we were doing. And by this point, we had a pat answer to that and said, well, we're out here, and we're helping people who need a little help. If they're down on their luck and they need help getting to a shelter, getting to a food program, we're out here. So if you ever find yourself in that situation, or someone in that situation, we're your guys, right? And he just shook his head, and he looked at us and said, no. Because the people who are out here on the streets, they know where the shelters are. They know where the meal programs are. That's not what you're doing. He said, here's what you're doing. You come out here and you just talk to people, and you look into their eyes, and you see into their hearts, and you remind them that they're good people and they're worth your time. No one else does that for them. No one else. Everywhere else they go, they get processed through a meal program line or some such thing. But you guys come out here and you spend time with them, and you look into their eyes and you see into their hearts and you remind them they're good people. And then he turned and walked away. And I looked at Tony and said, never mind. You know, we understand why we're here. We turned around to see where he had gone, but he was just gone.